it's not about we're good and everybody else in the past is bad, or we're trying to make bad guys of all the heroes. It's just owning up to the realities that went on.
You're listening to As in Heaven, a Christian conversation on race and justice. This episode is part 2 in a 2-part episode series on Black history led by Dr. Ligon Duncan. Dr. Duncan led us from 1619 up to the Civil War in part 1, and now we pick up with Reconstruction. He unpacks the sordid practices of peonage and vagrancy laws and sharecropping, and how these helped pave the way for Jim Crow laws in America. As I mentioned in the intro of the last episode, when we understand these historical variables and how they still impact our cultural moment today, it helps us have greater empathy for those who were affected by them. Jim Davis is your host. Justin Holcomb is the guest co-host on this episode. Mike Graham is the executive producer. I'm the technical producer, Matt Kenyon. And without further ado, please enjoy this episode of As in Heaven with Dr. Ligon Duncan.
All right, welcome back to As in Heaven Season 2. We get to have another episode with Dr. Ligon Duncan, Chancellor of Reformed Theological Seminary, where Justin, he teaches there. We both graduated from there. Dr. Duncan is somebody that I've appreciated for a long time as I've got to know you in Mississippi. You've preached in my church. Just really appreciate all the ways you're navigating, leading Reformed Theological Seminary in this unique COVID time. And you really are you are so helpful in this conversation on race for so many reasons. You walked us through the era of, let's say, Jamestown to the Civil War. And now we kind of want to dive a little bit more into this next period of the Civil War to the Civil Rights era, because it really is one of the least known eras and contributed arguably as much to where we are today as slavery itself did. So I don't think it's widely debated. I'm not the historian you are, but I don't think it's widely debated that Reconstruction had some major flaws. Would you be able to walk us through some of those flaws as we try to recover from the Civil War?
Well, let me first of all start, Jim, by saying I agree with you. This is an era of history that is really not well known by your typical American. When you've studied your American history at high school and college level, most Americans don't know this era. All of us, we tend to focus on the glamorous things and the heroic things. So we know the Revolution, and we know the War of 1812. And we know the American Civil War, and we know World War I, and we know World War II. And maybe we get into a little bit of Vietnam and the unrest of the 60s. But generally, this is a section of American history that people don't camp on when they're teaching. And by the way, it doesn't matter where you study American history. One of the interesting things about the study of Reconstruction in the last 30 or 40 years that has come out is professional historians have noted that the history textbooks in the northern United States generally gave sort of a Southern take on Reconstructionism. That is, they were very, very sympathetic towards the Southern complaints against the Reconstruction governments themselves to 1877, and then not adequately talking about the social ramifications of that in Jim Crow culture. So the first thing I want to say is that this is an area of history where we could all, as Americans, benefit from giving a little more attention. And if I were to turn my camera somehow to show you my shelf here in my home office, you'd see an entire row of books that are on this era of history. Why? Because as a guy that graduated undergraduate in history at Furman, that studied historical theology at the master's level and at the PhD level. I don't know enough about this, and I'm trying to educate myself now. I'm almost 60 years old about things that really I should have known in my 20s, Jim. So, if anybody thinks I'm wagging my finger at them, I promise you I'm wagging my finger at myself before I'm wagging my finger at anybody else. So let me come back to Reconstruction and say here's the typical way that Reconstructionism is sort of taught at the high school or college level. In Reconstruction, you had military and political occupation of the South by the Union. You had a lot of cronyism and corruption and carpetbaggers and scalawags and unscrupulous things. And finally, 1877, Reconstruction ends. Southerners throw off the oppressive yoke of federal interventionism, and things start getting back to normal again, and Southerners could rebuild their way of life. And when you go into that history now with your eyes open, what you realize is that's a terrible retelling of that history. And what actually happened is a lot of the worst things today, Jim, really, their roots are there, even more than from before the war, okay? Like, I think a lot of the racial animus that exists in the southern United States derives from Reconstruction, more than from before the war. Now, part of that is because the power dynamics have changed. Southern power in the dominant class is not threatened before the war. After the war, it's threatened. Power sharing is mandated during Reconstruction, and then there's an attempt to re-grab the power by the dominant class, and that's definitely what is going on in the era right after Reconstruction. In the meantime, they're working really hard to rewrite the history of the war. So you have Southern leadership saying we're going to retell this thing in a way that is going to be more compelling and more favorable to us. And so it doesn't surprise me that Southerners are unaware, because there have been people that have been working hard for them to be unaware of these things. And both my father and my father-in-law were publishers, and I've got books that they published that published this kind of view of Reconstruction, and told the stories of the carpetbaggers and the scalawags and these awful corrupt Republican governments with incompetent people that were in them. And I go back now, and you find out about guys like Robert Smalls in South Carolina, and there's some amazing Black leaders in that era. And I almost wonder, where did these people come from? Because they're like these unbelievably classically trained, historically rounded people. I'm going, how in the world, in the context of slavery, were we able to produce people that know all these things and can function at this level? But, there was every roadblock that could be thrown up against them was thrown up against them by the dominant white population. By the way, one thing that we haven't said yet, and I just want to mention it before we just pass on, is this. The idea of white is really a 19th century idea. Whiteness, you're hearing a lot of stuff about white fragility and whiteness and all this kind of stuff. And one thing that I would say to people today is be careful not to overreact against something that itself was a social construct with another social construct. Because the idea of whiteness is clearly a 19th century idea. And by the way, it's shorthand really for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from Northern Europe, okay? Because there's just as much prejudice against those kinds of people, with those kinds of people towards East Europeans or Italians or even Irish and Polish and other lower class immigrants as there are against other races. And so this whole idea of whiteness and defining whiteness is a 19th century idea. And so I think it's really important not to read that back into the annals of all history. That in and of itself was a social power construct that was meant to keep power for a particular dominant class. And of course, all sorts of stuff happens post-Reconstruction, Jim, that's designed to do just that.
You made a point that things can be interpreted to have gotten worse after the war regarding racial justice. And in our last episode, where we had you talked about slave codes, and now in this time we have black codes. Can you explain what black codes are and how they affected the Reconstruction?
Well, after the war, you already and especially after Reconstruction, after all the federal constraints are gone, you immediately start seeing people in state governments write codes and even new constitutions, Justin, that are designed to disenfranchise black people politically and economically. So, for instance, in Mississippi in 1894, we write a new constitution. And interestingly, by the way, we adopt a new flag in 1894. And that new flag has the Confederate battle flag, the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, emblazoned in the upper left corner canton. And that it's meant to send a message. It's meant to send a message to Washington, D.C., but it's especially meant to send a message to a majority of the people that occupy the state of Mississippi who happen to be black. And the message is, this is not your state. This is our state. And we're in charge here, and you're not. And the Constitution of 1894 puts into place a range of electoral advantages to white people in Mississippi because, again, white people, they're threatened because they're the numerical minority, and they don't want blacks to coalesce and have political power. There are restrictions on black involvement in political parties. There are things start coming into place like poll taxes and literacy tests and all manner of things in these sorts of black codes that are meant to limit and diminish black political power and equal access to the law. And I mean, it happened, by the way, Mississippi's Constitution of 1894 becomes a template for how everybody else in the South is going to try and do this. And that's really the beginning of Jim Crow. That's what we now call Jim Crow. And it's all designed to restrict black political power and economic power, and to continue to enfranchise that power in the dominant group in society.
And am I correct to understand that it was primarily infringing on political power, but also included all the way down to just real life, signing contracts, marrying, settling, where to settle? Was it just political, or does it comprehensive?
Oh, absolutely. That's right. It hits economic. It hits at society. Who can sign as a witness on a contract? Who can, what property rights? All manner of things are touched upon in that area. And let me say, here's the other thing. And I'm not sure when this dawned on me. There's a little clip that you can get, maybe just Google it, of Martin Luther King talking about why African Americans are in a different position than other immigrants to the United States, and even to Native Americans. And he explains that, look, the other immigrants were being offered 40 acres and a mule. Even as awful as the Trail of Tears is, there's still, there's a U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, and there are at least some negotiations that are going along there, providing not reparations, but at least certain provisions for the Native Americans, but for for Black Americans, they were released from slavery with nothing. You know, I was reared on these stories, and I don't want to make complete fun of them. But for instance, here's a family story that was told that my great grandfather McDowell in Liberty Hill, South Carolina, after the war, would plow in his frock tail coat, because he no longer has slaves, and he had lived a patrician life, and the only clothes that he had were what we would call today white tie and tails, and he would be out plowing in his frock tail coat. And then it would be told, and all his slaves loved him so much that they stayed with him after the war. Well, that kind of story can be told by white Southerners to buttress various myths. Black slaves must not have been treated that badly. Why in the world would they stay around after the war? Well, here's the question. Where would they go? And what would they do? And how would they feel that they've got nothing? Okay, they're free, but they've got zilch, nada. They have no property. They have no money. They have no social enfranchisement. Where exactly are they going to go? And so really the survival of American Black folk descended from slaves, it's one of the great stories in the history of the world of people literally starting with nothing and being able to get where they are today. And that story is usually told the other way around, right? It's told in a way that's denigrative towards Black people that were freed from slavery. Really, it's remarkable. They start with nothing, and they have to get to where they get. And so that's during Reconstruction that happens. That's not even after Reconstruction. That's the case. I've often thought that Reconstruction would have started off so much better if Lincoln had not been shot. Because Andrew Johnson is not able to exercise the moral authority and probably doesn't even have the inclination to do the things that Lincoln would have done. I know Lincoln would have been magnanimous. And he would have had clout with the Northern radical Republicans that Andrew Johnson never would have had with them. And I think that would have been a very, very. It's ironic that Lincoln was hated so much by the American South that he was viewed as the great villain, and people would celebrate when news of his death came. But that probably hurt the American South and Reconstruction more than any other thing, is the loss of Lincoln. But the Black folks were already in a world of hurt, even in Reconstruction, even with federal intervention. And then when the federal troops are gone and the federal attention is gone, things go from bad to worse. And then the Black codes are able to spread in an unfettered way, and they do. For the next, really, they do for the next 80 years. The things like the Black codes are going on all the way into the 1960s. And they everything from where Black people can buy homes, whether they can get loans, in every part of society.
And this is a perfect transition to the next topic, which is what is now known as slavery by another name. And there are numerous aspects to this that we'll unpack. But first, just getting to the kind of the foundation and the basic of sharecropping. What is sharecropping and how is it abused?
Well, again, if you are farming on land that belongs to someone else, and you have limited investment in that, you can have just like payday lenders can take 40% of your check. The guy that you're farming the land from can take an inordinate amount of your yield, all in the name of, hey, you don't own the land, I own the land. I'm a businessman, and and I'm generously working with you on my land, and the cut of what you create, disproportionately goes to someone else. By the way, interestingly, Justin, an EPC minister in Louisiana has been, and I won't embarrass him by saying his name, but he's been one of the real generous supporters of the African American Leadership Scholarship at RTS. And he came to me, it was more than a decade ago, and he said, I realized that my family, they had massive plantations in Louisiana before the war. They had massive sharecropping farms after the war. And I realized that my family had disproportionately benefited from the labor of these African Americans, most of whom were Christians, Bible-believing Christians like me. And one thing I want to do is I want to give to this scholarship fund out of my family money, because I know that some of my family money exists today because of the labor of these folks. And so that kind of thing, that economic disadvantage, again, you can think when you just like a person with bad credit or no credit is in trouble when you go to buy a car or get a loan to do something. Well, think of that and worse in a system like sharecropping. You're over a barrel in that kind of a setting.
All right, so sharecropping is one aspect of slavery by another name. You have peonage or debt slavery. You have vagrancy laws. And really these things begin to work together to put African Americans in a position where they can't get a job. And then they are, they're actually laws that put them in jail because they can't get a job that society doesn't allow them to have. And it seems like it becomes this self-perpetuating thing. So I'd just love for you to speak to that. I know in Mississippi, at one point, if my statistics are right, 70% of the state's income was from African Americans in prison doing work, doing labor for them. So flesh all that out.
Again, that would have been a part of history that I would have been completely oblivious to until, 20 years ago, Jim. And one thing that I've kicked myself about is I took Old South, New South at Furman University under an excellent historian, Albert Sanders. Just did we read all of the classic stuff, Van Woodward, all of the stuff. And somehow this did not register to me. I've even gone back. David Calhoun at Covenant Seminary taught, there was a THM level course called Southern Presbyterianism. And I pull my notes out about, 5-7 years ago to that class. And he had sprinkled all the breadcrumbs out for me. And I would have taken that somewhere 1985, 1986, maybe early 1987. And it just didn't click. I might as well have been studying ancient Italy or something like that. It just didn't click. And so I don't think a lot of people know that today when people hear folks talking about criminal justice reform and prison reform, that there are things that we are dealing with today that are rooted in, you arrest a guy for vagrancy, you put him in prison, you give him this ridiculous sentence, and then you lease him out to do contract work for the local plantation. Well, he's a free man now. There's no slavery anymore, but he's doing contract labor, and the state's making money off of it. And this is happening all over the place in the southern United States. So what you have is a legal system, an economic system, and a social system that is designed to thwart the purposes of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Bill of Rights and all the other things that are ours as Americans for a particular class of Americans. And, so everything from the black codes to debt laws to criminal justice, it's all affected by this.
Well, and probably the most dangerous thing is black people having a vote now. So the next logical step would be to discourage black people from voting. How did that happen?
Well, and we've said a little bit about that. Sometimes you do it through poll taxes. Sometimes, and people don't have the money. They're scraping by. They're functionally living on a barter system. If they're what are they going to bring? Corn to the poll to pay their poll tax, or you have some sort of a crazy literacy test or historical test that's required, and all of it is designed to suppress the black vote. And again, it's in a context where you have a large proportion of the population in the southern United States in that period of time is African American. If they're politically enfranchised, they're politically powerful. And whereas you had a lot of black party involvement during Reconstruction, there are deliberate attempts after Reconstruction to prohibit black participation in political parties and in voting.
And I would the KKK would be assumed very involved in that as well.
And the KKK is not the only organization. In South Carolina, it was the Red Shirts. General Wade Hampton was a Civil War general, very prominent member of society in the upcountry of South Carolina, and he started the Red Shirts. And they were doing the same kinds of things as the KKK. And so, you have on the one hand these actual governmental legal law things that are being done. And then you have these extra governmental, extra legal, illegal things that are being done on top of that, basically in order to terrorize people. A lot of people have talked since 9/11 about the war on terror. And I think people that look like me and that come from my background cannot conceive of what it is like to be in the United States of America and have your government against you.
Well, when you bring up the idea of terror and the use of terror, it leads right into this question. A horrific legacy of this period were lynchings and sexual mutilations that were executed outside of the justice system and were still allowed to happen in the West and in the South, and which then the purpose is to terrorize and to create fear and to get in people's heads. But why would you say it's important for future generations to know about this topic? And I'm thinking through the thousands of lynchings, the Tulsa massacre, the Red Summer, Rosewood massacre. I mean, it's all of these lynchings. Why is that important to point to, tell the truth about, and to tell current and future generations?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I do remember studying some of these things in history in high school and college and elsewhere, but there were usually code words that were used, like race riots would be used. And that's often a code word for a race massacre. And so there are all sorts of ways that these things have been papered over in the history that we have studied in our schools that keep it from coming home. Now, I've often thought, if you had lynched 4,500 white people, between the 1870s and the 1960s, I mean, we'd have destroyed the world over that. I mean, we'd have been dropping bombs everywhere. We would have just gone ballistic on that. And yet that's a story of a large population of our fellow Americans. And look, as a Southerner, Southerners, we live in history. And look, as a Southerner of Scottish descent, I was taught that Midsummer's Day 1314 is the year that Robert the Bruce defeated the wicked English and expelled them from Scotland and gained Scottish independence. That's 700 and something years ago, Justin. And I'm being rehearsed this as a young Southerner that I'm supposed to remember and have in my bloodstream. Well, good grief. If that's the case, shouldn't I care about these things that have happened to my fellow citizens, many of whom are my brothers and sisters in Christ? That's their history, and so it's my history too. And it's an amazing perseverance that my Black American friends have endured. And all of us ought to care about that. That's our story. And look, on this call, we're all Calvinists. Okay, now of all the peoples on the free earth, Calvinists ought to know that we are totally depraved, and we should not be surprised when people act totally depraved in societies and governments and cultures. And we shouldn't have some sort of a sort of a Disney-fied view of history that everything is all sweet and nice and wonderful. No, there are awful, horrible things that have happened, and that's part of the truth too. So part of telling the truth is coping with those awful, horrible things and owning them. Because oftentimes, and you'll know this even at the level of personal counseling, Justin, until you can face the reality, sometimes you get trapped in it and you can't move on. And I really think that has socially happened almost at a pathological level for large parts of our culture. We're trapped in a myth and we can't move on. We got stuck in history because we can't face up to it. So I want to know those things because that's an experience of a large portion of our fellow citizens, and many of whom are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And that makes it our history collectively as Americans. That's all of our history, but it's also a special experience of the American history and life and government and culture that most people that look like me have never experienced. There was never anything like that aimed at people that look like me at any time in the 400-year history of this country and culture. So that's just super important for us to pay attention to.
And you mentioned just the pastoral, just as a side note, there is real power in what you called it, naming and acknowledging, and just pastoral care of or in Luther's term, as his reflection on the Heidelberg was calling a thing what it is. Now, that phrase is used theologically, but naming and acknowledging, because then you're not denying it, you're not minimizing it, you're not dismissing it, and there's a power in doing that historically. I mean, it was powerful hearing you just talk about, get me crying thinking about, like, this is our history. This is my brother and sister in Christ, and you feel it a lot more. The 4,743 people who were lynched, that's a different story when it's our history.
Yes. Amen.
Well, it's so important because I grew up in Orlando. I'm third generation Orlando, which means my people were here before there was a good reason to be here. And if you ask most people from Orlando, what's the biggest massacre in your community's history? I think everybody would say Pulse, the Pulse shooting. It was a horrible, tragic shooting, but it's not actually the biggest one. The Ocoee massacre, one of these massacres, probably was larger than Pulse, but I didn't even know that was a thing until very recently. So I appreciate that you said that.
That's part of my experience too, Jim. I just didn't realize these things. There's been a little controversy going. It's been bubbling for a few years in South Carolina over the name of the oldest building, not the largest, but the oldest building on the Clemson University campus, the Ben Tillman Hall. And the controversy has been because Tillman was a notorious racist. He was the governor of South Carolina. And the reason his name is on the hall is his son was on the board of trustees and wanted his father honored for the role that he had played in having a land grant institution established. But Tillman was involved in one of the worst race massacres in the history of the state of South Carolina. And today he would be in prison or going to the electric chair for doing the things that he had done. And so, all of us ought to care about that. It's not about, it's not about, we're good and everybody else in the past is bad, or we're trying to make bad guys of all the heroes. It's just owning up to the realities that went on. It's very interesting in reading the works of Francis Grimke. Grimke talks about Tillman all the time because he ended up being a U.S. senator. And Grimke just takes him down in his writings. And I had known a little bit about, his nickname in South Carolina is Pitchfork Ben Tillman. And in the upstate, he's mostly known as being an anti-Columbia. Columbia is our state capital, and an anti-Columbia upstate, pro-upstate politician. But he did awful things and was involved in things like you've just described. And it's important for us to know that and care about that.
Well, one thing I'd like to ask you to drill down on a little bit, we've already kind of touched it in the periphery. We know that many tactics were employed to keep people of color not just without power, but in one area of town. So how was that done, and how did the cloistering of black people into ghettos affect generations of accumulated wealth for blacks versus whites?
Well, I mean, there are different names that have been given to that. One name that comes into play in the 20th century is redlining, and there would be literally places in town where black people would not be sold to. And so there were only certain parts of the town that they could go to. And that clustering also led to the creation of what become the ghettos. And by the way, that's a thing not just in the southern United States. That's the thing in the northern United States. One of the books that I was trying to reach down and grab is called Sweet Land of Liberty, and it's basically the forgotten history of the story of the northern civil rights struggle. And so these realities are not just Southern realities. There's, again, just like we were saying in the last show, they're continually realities in every part of the United States, north, south, east, and west. And so, they're not only do black people lack the capital that most of the dominant culture has at its disposal, but they're trapped in not being able to buy in the best parts of the city where they're going to hold, instead of their investment depreciating, it's going to appreciate. And so, those sorts of things have a generational effect. Property, especially, there are few things that are more important in terms of building wealth in terms of property and being able to hand it on. And when you don't have access to decent areas, and you're kept in the worst parts, it puts you at a disadvantage that can't be overcome in any other way.
So it's funny you say that. When we bought our very first house in Starkville, Mississippi, walking distance from downtown, we had this deed that was given to us that said the kind of the neighborhood covenants, and I could only have one cow. If I had a tractor, I had to park it over here, and the house could never be sold to a black person. And I remember thinking, I can't sign this, and the realtors were like, "Oh, there's nothing to sign." But my neighborhood, and I think that's deed-based restrictions. I think that's the term.
Yeah, and look, that continued even after all of the laws that were passed in the 1990s to try and redress those kinds of situations. Jim, for instance, I remember as my wife and I were looking for our first home, we had a realtor that knew Northeast Jackson very well. And we would look at a particular area, and she was not allowed to say, that's a mixed race neighborhood because of the new regulations that have been passed trying to deal with these. But realtors had code words. So she said, no, you don't want to look there. That neighborhood has lost its luster. And so she had not violated the law that had been passed that told them that they couldn't do things like that. But she had sent us a cue. You don't want to look there, because that's a mixed race neighborhood, or black people live in that neighborhood. So, those are just continuing realities that are artifacts of things that were actually written into law and to code in earlier times.
We're turning the corner to the finish line. So I have one last question, and then Jim will finish things off with, I think he has another question or two. But I'm asking you for advice. Imagine a conversation where someone says something like this, and I would like your response. Why do you keep on bringing up slavery, Jim Crow laws, and all that stuff is a distant history to us? So why do you keep bringing this up? Now, you gave a hint of it when you started talking about lynching and it's our history, but kind of the larger story of why talking about Reconstruction and redlining and Jim Crow laws and slavery by another name. Why talk about all of this if it's such a distant history? There seems to be behind that kind of question a type of suspicion of why would you tell that story. So as a historian, how do you respond to that?
Well, look, here's the way I talk to Southerners, Justin. To other Southerners, I say, look, we've been taught never to forget. We've been taught always to remember. Why do we suddenly want to develop amnesia in this other area? We want to never forget that our ancestor was in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, but we do want to forget that 35 years ago, this guy couldn't get a job because he was black. And you don't think that impacted his family? I can tell you family stories about how we don't like parts of the family because of what they did in 1873. But we don't care about what happened to a person in 1934 or 1954 or 1964 or 1972. And so that history is a lot closer than people realize. You'll get a kick out of this. In 1999, after I had been the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Jackson for 3 years, I did the funeral of a daughter of a Confederate veteran. Now, you're saying the math doesn't add up. Hold on, listen to me. He was 16 years old when he fought in the Civil War. He married, outlived his first wife, remarried, outlived his second wife. And in the 1890s, he married again, a third wife. He was, 30 years older than she was. And in the year 1900, they had a daughter. So he had fought in the Confederate Army, and his daughter was 99 years old in the year 1999, and I did her funeral. So the Civil War is closer than a lot of people realize to us. And still, white Southerners are told, remember that, remember that's really important. Why wouldn't we want to remember these other things? That's one thing that I would say, Justin. The other thing is that this has immediate today effects in ways that I think, because most white people have not been affected by this, we don't realize. So I'll give you an example. One of my professors, Dr. Carl Ellis, is a provost professor of theology. He teaches mostly at Atlanta, but he teaches at Jackson and DC and all over the place. Dr. Ellis's dad was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. And when he came back after the war, his dream was to be a commercial pilot. Guess what he couldn't be because he was black? He could not be a commercial pilot. Now, do you think that economically impacted Carl Ellis and his family, that his dad could not be a commercial? You better believe it dramatically impacted his family that he could not be a commercial pilot. Well, Carl Ellis is my friend. So what happened in the 1940s after Carl Ellis's dad fought for our country, risked his life for our way of life and for freedom here and around the world, and then came back and could not be a commercial pilot? That has an impact today. All of us ought to care about that. All of us ought to care about that, and especially about fellow Christians. So that, I think those are the two ways, Justin, that I would start that kind of conversation with a fellow Southerner who's maybe skeptical about this.
Well, Dr. Carl Ellis is going to tell that story on this podcast, so I'm glad you could give that cross promotion there. My last question for you: you started out talking about the flag, and you had a lot. You were involved and influential, I would say, in the process of changing the flag this year. Can you speak to your thoughts and what drives you to be a part of that process in the great state of Mississippi?
Well, again, a lot of it, Jim, is just realizing the huge lost gospel opportunity that has been this long, sad story of Jim Crow and lynching and anti-civil rights and all the other stuff. Can you imagine the gospel impact if Bible-believing Protestants, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians had said of their Bible-believing Christian brothers and sisters in Baptist churches and elsewhere, you're not going to kill our brothers and sisters in Christ. You're not going to defraud our brothers and sisters in Christ. You're not going to wrongfully imprison our brothers and sisters in Christ. You're not going to mistreat our brothers and sisters. Can you imagine the gospel impact of that? And, it's going to take us 100 years to overcome the trust issues that have come out of that. I tell people my very best Black friends have trouble trusting me for really good reasons, because people like me have been doing awful things to them and to their families for 4 centuries. It's going to take a while before the trust issues that exist between otherwise good friends in Christ are going to be addressed. We've got generational issues here. So for me, being able to work on the flag was just one small symbolic thing, one little thing that we could do together. And by the way, it was a wonderfully unifying thing. It brought together people from really, really different backgrounds and political persuasions in the state. And it was amazing to watch that process. It kind of took everybody to get it done. And it was one way that as a Christian, I could help say, we want everyone in this state to know that you're our neighbor, and we want to love our neighbors, and you're in the image of God, and we want you to be treated with dignity. And this state belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. This is your state. And I think I saw wonderful things happen in that process, Jim. And I had a very, very small role. There have been people that have been working on this for 50 years. Black legislators like Hillman Fraser and others. They've been working on this for years and years and years. I'm a Johnny-come-lately to this, but I had been talking for 5 or 6 years with a group of guys about what we could do to get this changed. And we thought we might be able to get it changed after the killings in Charleston, South Carolina. There was a little bit of political energy here in Mississippi when South Carolina took the Confederate battle flag off the state capitol grounds, that maybe we could get it done then. That failed. Right when I came to Mississippi, there was a flag referendum, and it failed. But this, several things coalesced, and this was the time. And it was a privilege to be involved in that. And, I think we're going to end up with a good unifying symbol for the state that everybody's going to, feel much, much better about as signifying our way forward in the state of Mississippi.
Well, Dr. Ligon Duncan, it always amazes me what you can just pull out of the top of your head, and I'm thankful for your time. I consider it a privilege to call you a friend. You make me proud to be an RTS alum. We're thankful for your voice, thankful for your time, and certainly praying for you and your ministry.
Thank you so much, Jim and Justin. It's been great to talk with you about these things. Thanks for doing this series, and I hope it's a real blessing to the folks that listen.
For more interviews, resources, and discussion questions based on the content you've heard, go to asinheaven.com. That's ASINHVN.com. If you liked this episode, please take a second to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, which you can do right from the Apple Podcasts app if you're listening there, or take a second to share it with a friend. Thanks again for listening.